Hello, everyone. Good morning, afternoon, and evening to you all. Welcome to part 6 of our Exploring Ethics webinar series. We're delighted that you're here today. Thank you all for joining us. As a reminder, our series takes place every Wednesday on the same Zoom link and generally at this time. So we look forward to seeing you here every Wednesday from May to June. Please take a look at the chat now for our website where you can find our schedule and recordings. We have some great webinars coming up in the near future, and we'd be delighted for you to join us. Please keep in mind that you will be muted during this presentation, but we encourage you to use the chat function to ask questions, share your insights, and speak with others attending the webinar. We'll be sure to reflect on all your comments and questions during our Q&A session at the end and unmute you all during this time. Please also note we will be recording. We record for those who either missed or would like to rewatch the series. Please rest assured your videos will not be recorded. Only our speakers' videos and their presentations will appear in our recording. Thank you all very much again for joining us. We'll now have Professor David Etkin introducing our speaker for today.
Talk on the topic of Zen and the art of disaster management. I'm just going to copy into the chat a brief description that he provided of his talk. So I've known Peter for many years, and I have to say he's one of the most brilliant, knowledgeable people that I know. And if I ever feel the need to feel more humble, all I need to do is talk to Peter about some topic, and I immediately get that feeling. Steeped in a deep knowledge of philosophy, environmental ethics, the social sciences, and a Buddhist by faith, he's a rare creature in this modern world that we live in, a Renaissance man. If you want to know more about Peter, I'm going to put in 2 links again in the chat where you can see descriptions of Peter and his work. And so without further ado, Peter, over to you.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for inviting me to this extraordinary series of lectures. My talk today was inspired in part by Dave Etkin. In the very first of this series, he talked about complex, wicked problems. And it prompted me, since I belong to a spiritual tradition that uses wicked problems as their central practice, sometimes called Zen, I thought maybe that I would connect the two of them. But fundamentally, I wanted to bring this together with disaster management. And weirdly enough, I'm going to share my screen now. Weirdly enough, it turns out when I was thinking about this, that I did this already, that way back in the early 1980s, I think I can do this. Yes. Back in the 1980s, beginning in 1980, in fact, 1979, I joined the Faculty of Environmental Studies at University of Toronto to look at risk and emergency planning. And also in 1980, I started off as a Zen Buddhist. So maybe this is my chance to link the two of them formally. My main theme today is not Zen Buddhism. I am certainly not here to promote it, nor is it to manage disasters. What I wanted to focus on, given we're talking about ethics, was the management of disaster managers. That is, to be open about it, to think about disaster management as a spiritual practice for disaster managers. Or to be even more open about it, to think about managing the disaster that is you and me most of the time anyway. And Buddhism, this is called the ultimate struggle. It's the struggle with ourselves. And so what I'm going to do is I wanted to start off with a little background on Buddhism and Zen practice, then to go on to talk a little bit about wicked problems. Then I want to sketch out some syndromes. I want to talk about problems and mysteries. I want to talk about some cases, some disaster cases that have cropped up either in my life or generally. And then I want to talk about some conclusions that we could bring to our own management of what it is that we are up to. So I want to start off by talking a bit about Buddhism. Buddhism is in case you don't know, is a spiritual tradition. It's well over 2,000 years old. It originated in North India about 2,000 years ago, more than that. And it's based on the idea or experience of awakening. The Buddha, the name of the founder of it, means the awakened one. And underneath it all is this idea of awakening from a fundamental dream. One image that's often used is the idea of, suppose that you're lying there asleep and you're being chased by demons, but you have a friend next to you who's awake and keeps trying to wake you up, and you're in your dream going, yes, I am going to wake up, but first of all, I got to deal with these demons. And the person outside is going, no, 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 just wake up, And the person inside dreams, yeah, I hear you, but first I got to deal with this demon before I wake up. That's more or less what the Buddhist tradition is about. The Buddha is sort of sitting outside your dream sleep going, wake up. And it's about dealing with the dreams that we have. It's about locking us into false forms of understanding and into a kind of suffering based on a misunderstanding of the way the world works. At least that's in the Buddhist tradition. A central tenet of the Buddhist tradition is that everything is in the process, that nothing is free from change, and that we live in a world which is more characterized by slow verbs than by nouns. We tend to look at everything as if it was a noun, but actually everything in the world, bricks and you and me, are actually slow verbs. And the intensive meditative practice, which you may know about in the Buddhist tradition, and which this Buddha is in the middle of, is about that. It's about an intense practice which makes you look at, let's call it sometimes breathing, sometimes walking the dishes, washing the dishes. It reveals things to us about the world around us, about how they are in the Buddhist tradition, slow verbs, but also about how we tend to fixate on these things in the world because we have an obsession with fixation. We're trying to fix things in the world, including ourselves. So Zen Buddhism is a kind of a hybrid of that. It's a hybrid. It came up a little later in the original tradition in China particularly, and it was hybridized with a tradition called Taoism. And Taoism is a tradition which is kind of famous in its own way for a thing called the way. In Buddhism, it would be called the Dharma. And this way is a sort of cosmic expert playfulness. It's famous for having very deep paradoxes to kind of blow our minds apart. Most famous one is the one that I have a image of here, which is of a Chinese philosopher, of course, a Chinese philosopher who is dreaming that he is a butterfly. And when the philosopher wakes up, he's never after that really quite sure that he's not a butterfly dreaming that he's a Chinese philosopher. And in the Taoist tradition, one of the most important things about the Taoist tradition, unlike other traditions, is it never really fully decides. You're never really sure whether it's philosopher or butterfly, and it's not a big problem. You can be one or the other one, or maybe neither of them. You're never really quite sure. This is different than, let's say, the Western Cartesian tradition, and it's a characteristic of some of the fundamental Taoist philosophers. This is Chuang-Tzu, the butterfly guy. These are different representations of him being a butterfly guy. And what happened was Zen was a kind of a hybrid of that 6 or 7 centuries later, brought Buddhism and Taoism together to create a way of looking at the original awakening experience that the Buddha was teaching, and to use it as a way of messing with our minds, and to break the hold of mental fixations. These mental fixations are everything down to the belief in a permanent self. The Buddhist tradition does not believe in a permanent, invulnerable self. If everything is changing, nothing is actually protected from everything else, which is what we try and do and why it causes us grief, suffering, and pleasure sometimes. Anyway, in some forms of Buddhism, Zen Buddhism, an aspiring student, someone who foolishly decides that they'd maybe like to be interested in this tradition, they're given a problem to solve. And this problem is called a koan, which you may have heard of. A koan is a probing question about the self or a dilemma that there appears to be no answer to. And what happens is that the student is given this koan, and here's one, for example: the way is so deep that birth and death cannot reach it. There are many others. What was your original face before your parents were born? But it doesn't have to be anything as deep as that. It can be things like, why do I die? Or why are children given fatal diseases when they're very young? Things like that. You can use those as particular koans. And in the tradition, what you're supposed to do is you're supposed to focus really tightly on your koan, the puzzle that you're given by your teacher, and you're supposed to try and solve it. And This is called the awakening of a great ball of doubt, the great mass of doubt. And it's called a Daigadan in Korean and in Chinese. And the more and more the student struggles with this, the more and more the student finds himself or herself in entanglement, in knots, in struggles, in battles, in what Dave was calling the essence of a wicked problem. And every time you try and solve it, it gets worse. Every time you go to your teacher and say, this is my solution, the teacher laughs at you and sends you away and sends you back to your cushion. And this can last for years and years and years until maybe possibly you're able to kind of break through this. And the idea is that the greater the ball of doubt you have, maybe the greater the awakening that you have afterwards. And this is what I think disasters are like. I think disasters are like a koan. They're like terrible puzzles. And they're puzzles that, faced with such disasters, we can only struggle to figure out what this disaster is presenting us with as disaster managers, and also to try and solve ourselves in the process of solving this disaster. This is a different way of thinking about disasters. And it brings up a completely different idea, or a related completely different idea, of the difference between problems and mysteries. Now, again, Dave brought us this question about wicked problems, so I decided to leap in as a Buddhist about this. But I wanted to talk about a Catholic existentialist. His name was Gabriel Marcel. And he came up with this fundamental idea in one of his early works of the difference between problems and mysteries. And he pointed out that problems comes from a Greek word problemata, and it means things that are thrown in front of you, problemata. And these problems are like walnuts. They're like, you just put them in front of you, you can break them open, you can eat the stuff inside and go on to the next walnut and go on like that. And problems are sort of like that. Mysteries are different, and I need to give you an example of that. So the example that I'll give you, this is a sardonic example. The example I will give you is, suppose you're on a plane flight, I hope soon, maybe to Bali or somewhere nice. And you happen to be sitting in the seat next to or in front of you is a mother with 2 screaming children. And so this is a problem. And to start with anyway, but if you are not the passenger sitting in those seats, but you're actually the mother of these 2 screaming children, these children are no longer problem children. They are mysteries. They raise questions. And the fundamental questions are things like, why did I have children? How do I get off this plane with my children without somebody killing me? Why did I have them? Why did I deserve to have these children? Why have I failed as mother? What does everybody else think, and so on? Mysteries are things that engulf you. They refuse to stand aside. They refuse to let you stand aside and solve them as if they were problems, and so on. And mysteries, they involve you, and you can't just stand outside. There's no outside to stand with a mystery. I've used these images. One of them is the problem, obviously, the guy using a thing to destroy concrete. The mysteries that I've picked on, the mysteries that I often pick on when I talk about, is the earth. I think the earth is a fundamental mystery. One of our problems is that we keep trying to solve the mystery of the earth as if it was a problem. And we have a lot of that in modernity. We have things that are very deep and very mysterious and that engulf us. This image of the earth from space was taken by a human being, so it's not really outside the earth. It's still within the mental frame of the earth. Only an earthling could have done this, at least at the moment anyway, in his earth-like spacesuit and so on. So in trying to solve the problems of environment, we find ourselves stuck in mystery. And the mystery is, who do we think we are as human beings? What is our future as earthlings, and so on? And that's what I do in environmental studies. That's one of my fundamental issues about environmental ethics, which is to think about the mystery of ourselves engulfed in how to solve planet Earth in a way that is not solving it as if it was a problem to be solved, but a mystery to be lived in and to be worked with, including the dealing with ourselves. Anyway, so just to hold it in your mind for a second, let me think of another example would be sex. Sex is a problem, love is a mystery. And if you find that your lovers have problems, if your love relationship is turned into nothing but problems, then maybe you need to go somewhere else. Or certainly if you're trying to treat your relationship with somebody as if it was a problem, then there are all kinds of red flags that need to be raised. Anyway, Modernity, as I've just kind of hinted, is the attempt to turn all mysteries into problems and to confuse the one with the other. And the supreme example is to treat other human beings as if they were simply problems and not mysteries. And disaster management is full of that. Trying to treat the mysteries of human beings and the problems and the things that human beings get involved in as if they were purely problems. And that's one of my things that I'm interested in. So, as I said, I tend to work on thinking about the mysteries of the earth, to try and think about how to wrestle with that as an environmentalist. But I also started off in part as a risk and emergency management person. And I just wanted to do some case studies to show you that at least I know a little bit about this subject. So this is the Mississauga train derailment. It was the very first thing that I got involved in when I joined the Institute for Environmental Studies at the University of Toronto. I'm going to talk about it for just a second. The derailment happened in November of 1979. In fact, I was in Mississauga that night, so I was evacuated and so on. Essentially what happened was a train derailed right at the last, and this is Mississauga, this is a train line going into Toronto, and it derailed right in the last open space before it became part of the built up area. And now this whole area is all condos and stuff, so they wouldn't have had enough time. But in this moment, it just happened that it was derailed. 36 cars, propane cars, which exploded and sent rockets of flame rolling all over the landscape, and a few chlorine cars, which were right in the middle of the mess. And the big issue for the evacuation, or for trying to deal with this, was what do we do about these chlorine cars? When do should we evacuate people? How should we deal with this? And through the night it was a Saturday, through the night, they slowly but surely decided to engage in various forms of evacuation from Mississauga. And after 24 hours, they'd evacuated 250,000 people from the area. Sardonic people have pointed out that people evacuate from Mississauga every morning anyway, so they're pretty used to that during rush hour. But in those days, it was quite extraordinary to be able to do that sort of thing. And there was only one person who was injured in the whole event, who was a reporter who fell off one of the rails trying to get to the scene of the accident. So things were going along pretty swimmingly with this. And then about 5 o'clock in the morning, they had to decide whether they were going to evacuate nursing homes in the area. And the first thing that happened to the people who were in charge in that point, who were the police and the fire department and I would call lower underlings, was, do we do this? Because at this point we're doing okay, but maybe we could lose more people from the response to the disaster than the disaster. And they had to make this decision. So the first koan was to solve the disaster. Will the disaster response kill more people than the disaster? Which is a classic disaster management issue response. And it turned out that they decided to evacuate, and it worked out okay. But what was really interesting to me, I went in there and I left and then came back in again, and I became in charge of looking at the government and non-government response to this whole event. And what I found was that the first few hours, nobody cared about anything other than nobody cared about money, nobody cared about time. Everyone just cared about getting all the people out and making the most of it. The fire department threw themselves at this disaster, propane cars flying all over the place, and nobody cared. After 24 hours after they'd done the first set of evacuations, they had the Attorney General came in. He created a kind of a small cabal of a small inner cabinet. And then within 48 hours, they created a bigger building. They brought in secretaries. And as I've said on many occasions, if the disaster had lasted more than a week, they would have built an office building around it. The whole thing turned into a huge bureaucratic event as the emergency developed. And as I just mentioned, what happened was that secretaries arose. They had created a kind of cabinet, a whole lot of stuff. Underlings arrived, forms had to be signed, and the rest of it. And then about 3 days into it, they started doing risk assessments. They started going, how much is it going to cost for us to keep out people from the 401, which is a highway that is just north of the main area. They started raising questions about, is the risk of having maybe possibly a leaking chlorine card, is that worse or better than question about, they had a whole discussion about seatbelts, about whether the risk involved were worth the costs in the $1 million. They started doing all these things which people would do in classic risk assessment. So I found this really interesting. And so part of my report was about how the whole process of doing risk assessments and all the rest of it, that was an after the fact, and why and when in a disaster do you start doing risk assessments, which is interesting because at the beginning, people were basically not doing risk assessments. They were basically throwing themselves at these risks without caring. So anyway, so many years later, actually no, 2 years later, I got to interview the mayor of Mississauga. Her name was Hazel McCallion, extraordinarily feisty lady, with my colleague, Dr. Ian Burton. And he and I went interviewed Hazel McCallion about her participation in this whole event. And one of my questions about halfway through was, so at the point when you started doing risk assessments, when you started thinking about whether the disaster management should move into a risk assessment phase, when you started assessing the costs and the rest of it, and Hazel McCallion said, we never did that. And I went, well, actually, we have, no, she said, we never did anything like that. The most important thing was the safety of the people of Mississauga. And I went, yes, absolutely. But isn't it interesting that you started doing like risk and monetary assessments and so on? And at that point, she threw us out of our office. This is the only time in my career that I've ever been thrown out of an office. Ian Burton will recognize this as well, because she didn't want that to be revealed, but also because it was in a particular context. So I found that particularly interesting. So I started working on this. I started to be interested in various paradoxes about this and the rest of it. So the first one, which I've already mentioned, was dissolving the disaster. Will the disaster response kill more people than the disaster? And this is actually quite familiar. This is from a thing called White's paradox. Gilbert White, who is a very famous geographer, he very early in his career started talking about how it was that to prevent flooding, we build more dams that encourage more people to move into the floodplain. And this kills more people, and maybe if the dam breaks. So it's a syndrome. It's a paradox and a syndrome. So here's my second case. My second case, again, this is from my own experience, was this is the evacuation zone around the Pickering nuclear plant in Toronto. And they've had a whole lot of detailed planning about what to do and all the rest of it. And it's near Toronto, so there are issues about that. And many years ago, actually not that many years ago, but just before 2000 anyway, I went to a high-level scenario planning meeting, which they still have. This is one called Exercise Unified Control, which is from 2017. And we had a day of working out scenarios. I now believe, I think now they do something like 53 scenarios when they do all this. Anyway, they did all this stuff. And I was doing emergency planning at that point because I'd been involved in Mississauga and written this report. And the nuclear industry was really interested in how to evacuate lots of people. So they invited me to come in as an expert, which I really wasn't, but I had written this report. And I talked about how traffic worked and the rest of it. Anyway, so they had this day of scenarios and the rest of it. Anyway, at lunch, I sat next to the senior member of the Ontario Provincial Police, who was going to be in charge of traffic. And I said to him, well, how do you think it's going? Do you like the plan? And he said, I think this plan is really stupid. And I said, oh, that's interesting. Like, are you going to talk about it? He said, no, I can't possibly talk about it. And I went, but we're here today to work our way through this. He said, yeah, but look, if you want to screw up all of this whole process about traffic and moving stuff and moving children into the schools and the rest of it, the only thing that's really important is to try not to do this disaster at 2 o'clock on a school day. Because if you do it on 2 o'clock on a school day, all the parents in the whole surrounding area are going to come and find their children. It doesn't matter what you do. It doesn't matter where you tell them they're going to be. People are going to get in their cars and they're going to drive along the main roads. And since there aren't designated roads, it's going to be complete, absolute chaos. Oh, I said, well, that's interesting. And I said, well, why don't, shouldn't you say something about this after lunch? He said, no, I have to leave at 4:30 and I don't want to spend the rest of my day here. So this brought me to and they're still doing this kind of thing. This is from 2017. Families will want to reunite. This is from 2000. They all depend on entry control measures put in place. But again, I always am haunted by this. Do this at 2 o'clock on a school day and see what happens. So here's number 2. Does it work on, it's wonderful in practice, but does it work on paper? That is, these are what I call shiny failures. That is, as you will all know if you're disaster managers, the real world is really messy. On paper, all of this looks beautiful, but then what does the transition look like? So I wanted to talk about a few other paradoxes and syndromes that come up, which you can use as koans, which you can use as personal puzzles, if you like. One of them is what I call "Stop Helping Like That, We Have Arrived." And this is from a comic book about Katrina, and it's about the mess around everything in Katrina, including Superdome and the rest of it, and how basically gangs came in to try and organize people and to try and bring food into the Superdome and all the rest of it. And the government at the time, which was, as you all know, kind of a disaster, this became a real problem for them. And again, when officialdom arrived, they had to deal with these unofficial helpers and how that was going to be handled. And it was handled extremely badly from the readings that I've done. A perfect book on this subject is by Rebecca Solnit called A Paradise Built in Hell, which if you haven't read, I would recommend it. And in it, she talks about the San Francisco earthquake, she talks about Katrina, she talks about a variety of other disasters, and how in these disasters, the local people, the community arose, and they did all kinds of extraordinary things, which were not suppressed, but they were interfered with when the government finally arrived and said, "Hi, we're here, stop doing whatever it is that you're doing." And so that is an interesting paradox. It's a paradox of stop helping like that, we have arrived. And how to manage that transition is always an interesting issue for disaster managers. So here's another one. Another one is people as perverse obstacles. That is, we're going to save you in spite of yourself. And this is because human beings are just like that. There is a very famous philosopher, her name is Simone Weil, and she wrote a very interesting book in the 1940s called The Iliad, or the Poem of Force. And in that, she talks about what happens when people are, as it were, fighting with each other on battlefields. This is the Iliad from Homer's Iliad about the Trojan War. And she pointed out that one of the things that happens when somebody is fighting with somebody else and they beat them and they're just about to kill them is that the person turns into an object. And we have many examples of that, not just in the Iliad, but treating enemies as if they were just objects, which is why we give them names like geeks and stuff like that, and dead meat and the rest of it. That is, one of the ways in which we kill other people is to turn them into objects just before we kill them, or even long before we kill them. So she talks about this as a way of thinking about violence. And she argues in her ways of talking about pacifism or peace is that one of the ways in which you can deal with this warrior problem is to get people to pause and actually acknowledge the humanity of the other person, which may give you that moment of pause to think about, well, maybe they're human, or maybe I need to assert my own humanity, and maybe I shouldn't actually kill them. And this is a deep, deep problem. The deep problem is that we tend to treat people as if they were obstacles to whatever it is that we want to do. The best example that I know of is if you're running for the bus and somebody is standing in your way talking on their phone and you try and get by them, they stop being human, they now become an obstacle to your getting on your bus. The thing is, they're getting in the way of your movement, your drive towards wherever it is that you're going. And we have examples, many, many examples of this in movies, particularly. Whenever I'm watching movies with many car crashes in them, Star Wars is another example where you can kill all kinds of stormtroopers because they are robots or they look like robots. And if you actually stopped in the middle of an exciting car crash in Terminator 2 and said, maybe you ought to think about whether there's enough hospitals for all the people who are going to need care, or maybe the whole movie would fall apart. What you want to do in a movie is you want to speed through all these crashes that the heroes are creating. You don't want to actually stop long enough to go, exactly how are we going to care for these people who have been now messed around? Again, wreck the movie. So one of the things that happens in floods, and this is from a really interesting 10-point lessons learned from the fire service website. I put the website firerescue.one in the bottom. And their number 5 is, people want to see you in times like this. Doesn't mean they want to leave with you. They will assume they're fine under the circumstances until water or food run out, or until the level of water continues to rise, just as you said it would. The picture below is quite a famous video from Joso in Japan, and it is a family that refused to leave from their flood because they didn't want to leave their dog behind. And this has been picked up by dog lovers everywhere, and is a perfect example of this whole thing that happens in disasters over and over again, of people perversely refusing to leave. I'm not saying they're perversely refusing to leave because they're not getting their dog, but people will wait till the last moment, or they won't leave, or they just refuse to do what we're asking them to do. This is a guy, this is from Katrina. This is a guy who had a cat, and he wanted to go to the Superdome, and they wouldn't let him in because they wouldn't allow pets in. So he decided to just go back and wander the streets. So as you will know, there is all kinds of issues about pets and about people and their pets in various disasters and so on. So we have a whole pile of these paradoxes and syndromes. Solving a disaster, will disaster response kill more people than the disaster? Does it work on, it's beautiful, but does it work on paper? I want you to stop helping like that. Then there's people as perverse obstacles who are, we want to save you in spite of yourself. And then finally, there is us, of course. And I wanted to connect up to expertise. You all know about expert issues. And this is a quote from Dogen, a 12th century Zen master. He says, when I first began Zen practice, mountains were mountains and rivers were rivers. As I trained, mountains were not mountains and rivers were not rivers. And now that I am deep in the way, mountains are once more mountains and rivers are once more rivers. This is how you learn, or what happens in learning. And I connect it with a very interesting article about the inflexibility of experts. This is from cognitive psychology from a long time ago. And what they did was they did a whole series of experiments on what's called the Einstellung effect. The Einstellung effect is a fixed response, or an already existing expert response. And what they did was they went and they basically did a whole series of experiments with chess masters, where they essentially gave them cases that had, as it were, suboptimal solutions, which are the most normal solutions, but that a real expert chess master would notice that and actually might head towards the expert, towards the best answer. The best answer was not the one that was the most optimal, if I can put it that way. Anyway, so what they did was they did this, and what they discovered was, which will come as no surprise, of course, to you all, because you are all real disaster management experts, was that the suboptimal solutions that were the normal solutions, that the ones that were standard in the literature, basically interfered with coming up with the really terrific best answer. And the only people who actually were able to come up with the best answer were people who were so expert that they actually could look back and check up on the suboptimal version that everybody else was answering. So their answer, if it was an answer, was that you need to get past the suboptimal solution and into a different realm, a realm of a different kind of creativity, a different kind of expert understanding, where you take into account the standard response and work beyond it. And so this is Dogen. I start off as mountains were mountains, and then as I got going, I sort of lost my way. And now that I'm deep in the way, I really, really have a better understanding of mountains and rivers and so on. So the last little thing I want to just mention is a samurai. This is Zen, so I had to bring in samurai warriors. And in the samurai tradition, there is a thing called suki, and suki is like this. Suppose that you're fighting. I seem to be bringing up fighting today. I'm not sure why. Suppose that you're fighting with an opponent, and you've got the flow, which is another Taoist idea. You're both battling backwards and forwards. Nobody is supreme. You're defending and attacking and so on. And if at some moment during this battle, you think to yourself, hey, wait a minute, I could get killed here. That's a suki, that's a pause. That's a piece of glue. It glues you. It creates a little gap, and that's when the opponent comes in and kills you. So that there are these moments in our attempt to understand what's going on, that we also have this issue of, if we pause to try and work out how to solve it, we might actually break the flow of what's going on. So maybe what we want to do is we actually want to work through the flow. We want to use our expert understanding to, as it were, flow with the flow. And yet we as experts are constantly breaking into the flow, but maybe that's a good thing. Maybe it's a good thing to break with the standard flow of how the disaster is working. And that's a koan. The puzzle that we face as disaster managers is to think about the flow, the management of the disaster, to think about it as a puzzle, to think about how we could help to resolve it, and yet not get in our own way. And getting in our own way is the essence of the Zen Buddhist practice. And I thought that would be a good way to end my presentation. I think I may be a minute or two early, I hope, anyway. So thank you. I'm open for questions or chat or whatever, or important questions, koan questions.
So Peter, I would like to thank you very much for that very interesting presentation, which has given me a lot to think about. So at this point, I'd like to open it up for questions. So you can either post your question in the chat session, or you can raise your hand. I wonder if we can stop screen sharing now. So if people want to sort of ask a live question, we can get into that.
Yeah, I don't know how to do this. Since I'm the co-host, can Elite take over?
No.
I will do my best.
So at the bottom, there's probably a button that says stop screen share.
Yeah, but my machine isn't letting me do that. That's what I've been trying to do.
Okay.
Without success. Okay, I think maybe that's it. Yeah. Okay.
Oh, there we go. Okay. So to begin with, any questions or comments from the audience? Well, maybe I'll start with one. Oh, there we go. Olivia, yes.
This might be a little bit of an unfair question, maybe, Peter, but I was thinking, how would the Zen kind of Buddhist approach, how would the COVID-19 response we've seen for the last two years, how would that differ? I mean, what would be the sort of distinct points of difference between the response we had and if we were trying to sort of pursue a more Zen Buddhist kind of approach? In particular, I was intrigued by this sort of expert problem, but I was thinking sort of more in line with that. So how would it sort of concretely differ? What would be some of the responses to a pandemic that we've seen now? Because the examples you've used are very interesting, but they're not sort of global in scale. So how would we address that?
I'd obviously have to think about it. I would say that the most important immediate thing, I mean, apart from the standard response and so, would be what are the paradoxical questions that are raised by it? And among the paradoxical questions that are raised by it are these fundamental koan questions, these questions about what's the relationship between freedom and vaccination? What's the difference between global, the need to get as many people vaccinated as possible versus people's supposed right to be able to do as they please, and is their right to do what they and so on. This is what you know is a quite standard ethical issue. So I have a couple of friends who have refused to be vaccinated, and we have been in this dilemma with them. And it's very interesting to try and wrestle with people who refuse, as far as I can tell, they essentially refuse to have anything to do with modern science. So you have to work your way back through that to the nature of evidence and all of those things that I'm sure you may have been involved with yourself. So that's how, as a local practitioner, I would wrestle with it. the Zen tradition is very concrete, very material. It would work with something. It would work with some particular version of that, and then it would expand it out to the global. And I'm pretty sure that you could work out your own version of this. I'm sure you've wrestled with this with colleagues and friends of your own, or enemies of your own. So that's what a Zen Buddhist would do. They would go, all right, let us sit down and let us think about freedom. Let's think about liberty. Let's think about what it means. Or alternatively, let's go another direction. Let's think about your body. Let's think about exactly how your body does what it does to create its own identity. And one of the ways it does to create its own identity is to create its immune system. The immune system, which is constantly creating your identity every moment. That's really where your identity seems to actually be residing at the moment. So what is that? What does it mean? What in the Buddhist tradition would be called your original face? Like what does it mean to have a body that does the kinds of things that the body does? And what is it? How does that interfere with or help break down this idea that I'm an independent body separate from everything else in the world, which is again antithetical to the Buddhist tradition, that we're actually physically interdependent. And what does that mean? People who don't agree with this find this to be really troublesome. So that's kind of how I would enter it. I'd enter it really, I think personally I'd enter it with this question about, do you understand how your body works? Which is something that is very difficult to get people to agree to. My experience, students too, it's very hard to get them to think about themselves as not being in a isolated bubble. I don't know, what do you think?
No, I mean, yeah. So so the tradition would be sort of from the material or from the local and out to the global.
Yes.
Like yeah, and that is of course different from the way I and others also think. Like we think like, what can we do on the global level?
Right.
But that's very interesting. Yeah.
I know Brian Schwartz posted a question. I'm not sure if you have your chat up, Peter, but he asks or notes, there are numerous problems and structures within mysteries. How does one break down the mystery without reverting to traditional problem solving?
Great question. I think there are different ways of coming at mysteries. I think one of them is to live with them, which is most traditional problems. People, again, have that sort of, it's something in front of me that I can deal with. Living with them is pretty good. Trying to work out what your relationship is to it is also interesting. I always keep using problems and so on. The thing about the Western tradition is we're very saturated in problem solving. And if you walk away from that, you then find yourself in doing other things, like relationships with people and so on. One of the great things about modernity is to try and make sure that things that people think are mysterious are actually just problems. So modernity has been very successful at a lot of that. Speaking of modern medicine is almost all of its progress has been to try and turn things that were considered to be grand mysteries into actual problems. But it does, again, kind of raise questions about whether or not, I don't know, home care is better than going into a hospital. There's a lot of medical issues around death and so on. Death, which is the fundamental mystery, to treat it as if it was a problem, and what happens when that breaks down or falls apart. So yeah, I mean, but it is how to handle mysteries is a interesting management problem.
Okay, there's another question by Alicia that just got posted. Can emergency managers or government or public consensus set what are the paradoxes and what are the mysteries for disaster? Or is it a personal decision?
In what I'm talking about today, I'm trying to, I didn't really get into other things that I would say about this. What I'm trying to do is to get disaster managers to think about themselves in disasters as opposed to how do I handle the disaster? I know that sounds narcissistic and selfish, but we tend to, again, try and treat the disaster as if it was a general problem, as opposed to something that challenges us personally. And this ranges all the way from, and again, I'm not talking to people who don't know what I'm talking about, is what we're doing the right thing? Is the society that we belong to the right society? Is this disaster an expression of fundamental ethical problems with the society that I am somehow helping to continue, and so on? So it's a personal decision that ramifies into the larger social context. And that's, I think, why it's not a total, it's a personal decision about the public consent, about the emergency managers, the ethics of emergency managers. So Dave is an expert in talking about what should disaster managers think ethically. And so I'm kind of in that Dave Etkin mode, which is to think about the profundity of disaster managers thinking about their own relationship to the disasters, which is, again, not absolutely about the government responses, but it is in there somewhere, I think.
So Peter, there's this saying that's become popularized, which is, we've met the enemy and he is us.
Right, Pogo.
And if you're with a bunch of disaster managers and you say that, they'll nod and agree. But actually the us isn't the disaster managers, the us is the public.
Okay.
So the public makes irrational decisions and therefore, we can't do our job properly, kind of thing. But should the us actually be emergency and disaster managers? When we externalize the us, are we missing the whole point of it? And that's part A. Part B, and this whole phrase, we've met the enemy and he is us, how does that relate to Buddhist philosophy?
Oh, well, the first part, of course, us is us. What I learned from being an emergency manager was that the citizens are obstacles mostly. Citizens are in the way of trying to solve this disaster, and that our understanding of people, you use the term irrational, and I find most people aren't really irrational in that they try and be rational, actually, in a weird way. They try and follow the rules and the rest of it. And then there's a whole range of rationalities that people are engaged in. So I find that complicating, as you do, I'm sure, as to how to read how you think the public is going to operate. So I think our understanding of us is very limited. So that would be my first thing. The Buddhist tradition is all about getting out of your own way. The whole Buddhist tradition is about that we are trapped in a fixation on ourselves, about our inability to understand how it is that our ways of thinking about ourselves frame and distort the actual reality that is around us. So yes, a central issue, this is for the Buddhist tradition. How emergency managers deal with it is what I've been kind of talking about today. But in the Buddhist tradition, it's all about trying to deal with the suffering that is brought on us by our not understanding the way the world really is. So it's very grounded in a particular kind of attempt to flush out our failures.
So if you were king of Canada and had absolute power.
I hear the place is about to become open again, isn't that right?
And you're really concerned about disasters and want to make Canada a better place from that perspective. And you're bringing this Zen lens to the problem. And you have your magic wand that you can wave and change whatever you want. What would you do?
Well, many years ago, I asked a version of this question to a Zen teacher, and I'm about to say something really terrible, so I just be warned. there was quite a famous Zen master who was in Toronto, and he from British Columbia. And I said, who do you think is probably the most Zen-like prime minister Canada's ever had, or the rest of it? And he said, oh, Jean Chrétien. And I said, why? Because everyone thought Jean Chrétien was a bumbling fool, and yet he was able to get amazing amounts of things done. And it looked as if he never did anything, and he was kind of like that. But this is a very Taoist Zen thing, that the person who looks as if they're not really accomplishing anything may actually be better by letting people do what they think they're doing, but they're actually being managed. So he thought Jean Chrétien was the great. So I wouldn't emulate Jean Chrétien, but I thought it was quite interesting that the person who was, as it were, the least, I won't say the least respected, but he had this sort of interesting prime ministerial way of operating, which is not usual if you compare him to, oh, I don't know, Stephen Harper or other people like that who are, go-getters, do stuff, and the rest of it. But people dislike Jean Chrétien, and they dislike his way of running the country. So anyway, I've avoided answering your question directly, but
You have avoided, so I'm still trying to figure out what you would do as king. Can you say something that's more tangible, I wonder?
Oh, I wouldn't be king. I don't.
Well, that's pretty tangible.
No, I don't believe in kings. I'm sorry. I don't believe in that.
Okay.
I don't believe in a hierarchical way of organizing things for just the reasons that I've been mentioning. I think there are quite different ways of organizing governments. The Buddhist tradition is very strongly communal, and I find that to be a much more powerful way of dealing with mysteries and dealing with the problems that mysteries can be related to.
Okay, there's another question from Clara.
Oh, hi, Claire.
It's in the chat. How can one get a perspective of a mystery when they are all in it? The point of framing issues as problems and people as obstacles, I believe, is precisely to stay emotionally distant, to get a clearer view, and that way coming with a better solution. Am I mistaken?
Wow. Well, again, I think the number one thing I was trying to say is that we are inside it, and to try and solve things that you are deeply inside is extremely difficult. It's extremely hard to do, and requires a non-problem set way of trying to deal with it. It's again like, I hate to go do this, but like going back to your relationships with some other people, if you have relationships with other people, you can't solve them by doing mathematics. You can't solve them in a problem setting way. And if you try and do that, very often it will backfire against you. And yet, if you can actually focus on the problems that may be happening, you may be actually able to handle some of them, which goes to the second part of what you were saying. I think if I go back to this expert analysis, or mountains, is that there is a way beyond being emotionally distant to get clearer. There's a way beyond that. I think it's very important to get clear. It's very important to get beyond clear, and it's very important to get beyond being clear to a new kind of clarity. And that's what the expertise that the Buddhists have always claimed, anyway, whether it's true or not, you just have to kind of work through it. That's what they've always claimed, that there is there's a better clarity. And the better clarity is one of the not the opposite of being emotionally distant, but maybe moments of emotional distance followed by emotional connection, followed by, do it backwards and forwards. This may be one of the reasons why, partly why science sometimes has been so successful, is people who are, out doing discovery, being emotionally distant, becoming very committed, but always trying to make sure that they find a way of flushing out their mistakes. So yeah, I think there's something, it's beyond emotional distance and beyond being totally emotionally in the middle of something, and finding a way beyond both of those, which is maybe the Zen way, I think. That's, since I'm not enlightened, in any real sense. That may be just my temporary solution.
Peter, if you're not enlightened, what hope is there for the rest of us?
Well, koan, there you go.
Good. There's this thing called the trap of the expert, which is that experts are really, really good at solving particular problems, but not so good at looking at broader context. And so sometimes they say they solved a problem, but they've only solved a subset of a problem, or they solved the wrong problem.
Right.
So you've been talking about the value of experts and so forth, and yet there is this trap. So I'm wondering how that fits into this achieving clarity.
How much time have I got?
2 minutes.
Okay. Well, I will just invoke Gregory Bateson. Gregory Bateson is famous for his book called Steps to an Ecology of Mind. And in Steps to Ecology of Mind, he has a number of interesting examples. And the example that he uses most often is Alcoholics Anonymous. And he talks about how one of the things Alcoholics Anonymous did was to try and raise the question about why we are constantly trying to solve problems in a way that makes the problems worse. And the example that he uses is somebody who believes that the way to solve their alcoholic problem is by having a stronger will. And the will suggests that they can use their will to actually stop their addiction. And the way to do that is to strengthen their will. And the best way to do that is to have another drink. And when they do that, they then continue the addiction. And he uses that for things like the cod fisheries and lots of other things, where the only way to solve the problem is to move beyond the local circle into a larger circle. And that's why he believed in myth and the rest of it, that if you break out beyond the ordinary circle, you can actually find what in Alcoholics Anonymous is that a higher power, or losing local control to maybe you can get larger control, which maybe this goes back to what Olivier was saying, that there's a way of organizing that larger perspective, what the Buddhists call big mind, Daishin, to try and work your way through how to solve these mysteries in a way that isn't problematic. Steps to an Ecology of Mind, I recommend it as a koan paradox ecology book.
So we're just about out of time. If somebody has one more quick question, I think we might be able to manage that in a minute or two. Are there any last questions or comments from anybody?
Good, quiet.
Okay, I think not. Well, in that case, I'd like to wrap up this session. Peter, I'd like to thank you for what is, as usual, a fascinating and interesting conversation. At one point, I did my very best to trap you, and I couldn't. You avoided it adroitly, as usual. But one of these days, I will be successful. So thank you, everybody, for coming, and look forward to seeing you again next week.
Take care.